Good afternoon. I'm David Wilco, and I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's Bradford seminar speaker, Barry New. And for Barry, this is something of a homecoming because Barry was a member of the Princeton class in 1971, majoring in biology, and he tells me that the last time he was on campus was in 1976. So Barry, we're delighted to welcome you back.
Yes.
And, I suspect the campus looks quite a bit different
yes.
from the way it did when you were there. Barry is a professor at the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State University, where he focuses on impacts of land management on endangered species and forest ecosystems. But he has had a truly interesting career path in that he has spent roughly equal amounts of time as a scientist in the federal government and as a scientist in academia, which has given him, I think, a rare perspective on how science operates in the ivory tower and in the real world. So he directed a U.S. Forest Service research lab in the Pacific Northwest, and he was chief scientist at the National Biological Service in the Interior Department during the Clinton administration, before then joining the faculty at Colorado State University. Both as a federal scientist and as an academic, he served on multiple federal advisory panels that have addressed really some of the nation's most controversial wildlife conflicts. And for his work, he's been awarded the Edward T. LaRoe Award from the Society for Conservation Biology, and Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship, and in 2008, he was appointed Distinguished Ecologist at Colorado State University. Barry's work has been both U.S.-centered and international, and it is some of that international work that he will focus on today, dealing with a highly appropriate species for this place and this audience. And it is a pleasure to welcome Barry New back to Princeton.
Thank you, David. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be back, though I hardly recognize parts of this campus. It's very different. I will say one of the wonderful things to walk around this campus now, as opposed to the late 60s, is seeing all of the women on campus, which is really an improvement, let me tell you. Okay, so this is a serendipitous picture on the way back from a day in the field in Dudhwa National Park in North India, taken by one of my grad students and now Dr. Pranav Chinchani. We were in our Jeep, and elephants just happened to be walking by, beautifully framed by this sal forest in North India. An outline of talk: status of tigers and their prey species in protected areas in North India. Talk about tiger use of the matrix land that surround these protected areas. Discuss the threats to tiger persistence, risks that humans face living in these landscapes. Talk about measures of human tolerance to sharing the landscape with dangerous animals, and end by a comparative degrees of tolerance, comparing the relative intolerance that we seem to have in North America to sharing the landscape to the much higher degree of tolerance that we observe in India. So there's the study organism. You don't want to see them quite this close when you're on foot in the field. It gets your heart rate raised really, really quickly. They are phenomenally beautiful and powerful animals. A little bit of the context for thinking about working on any large-bodied mammals, particularly carnivores. As I know this audience is aware, we're experiencing the 6 major extinction events largely caused by us, and those extinctions are disproportionately occurring in large-bodied animals. Often in apex consumers, the carnivores are most at risk. And then I want to talk a bit about the ecological consequences of the loss of large-bodied carnivores, particularly top-down controls on herbivore populations. I just put this slide in a couple days ago, and this is a remarkable paper that was in PNAS just about 6 months ago. This looks at the global distribution of mammalian biomass. And I'm a little bit surprised looking in Web of Science that I'm not seeing this paper cited more frequently, because I found it amazing and shocking. So currently, for all of mammals, and these are things like whales and dolphins, rhinos and elephants, 60% of mammalian biomass is in livestock, 36% in humans, and the remaining 4% in all other 5,000 plus species of mammals, clearly demonstrating the human dominance of the globe. And those threats are really pronounced in tropical and subtropical countries, the loss of large-bodied organisms, and we see India here at the top of the list. And it's really quite remarkable that India, with almost 1.3 billion people and a land area about the third the size of the continental US, has still retained the wild animals that it has on the landscape, including tigers. Let's talk a little bit about the role of carnivores in terms of top-down controls. We have two broad categories of factors that act as drivers in food webs and in population dynamics. Abiotic factors that are listed here, and biotic factors which ecologists have broken down into top-down and bottom-up controls. And our focus here is on what happens to ecological systems when we lose top-down controls through the process of carnivores consuming largely herbivorous species. So we can talk about the functional role of predators in ecological systems, their contribution to food web dynamics, and their contributions to what has been called trophic cascades. So here's an example of a gray wolf trophic cascade, and I'll talk about gray wolves near the end of my talk, where we have direct top-down effects of wolves on coyotes and elk, and that's then mediated through a number of indirect effects. So actually in Yellowstone ecosystem, wolves preying on coyotes has actually led to an increase in pronghorn population and an increase in small mammal populations. Wolves have had a decremental effect on the size of the elk population, which in turn has reduced herbivory and foraging in riparian ecosystems, which has led to some positive effects in terms of both birds and beavers, trophic cascades. And I want to acknowledge that trophic cascades are not always and everywhere true. There's actually been some pushback on people like Bob Beshta and Bill Ripple who have written about trophic cascades in Yellowstone ecosystem. But there's lots of evidence that trophic cascades are real, but they don't occur all the time and everywhere. It's not as simple as pouring carnivores back into an ecological system that you're going to observe trophic cascades. So let's focus on India's keystone predator, the tiger. But I want to introduce the stars of this talk. It's not me. It's two of my most recent PhD students, Dr. Pranav Chanchani and Dr. Rekha Warrior. Rekha still lives with us. She's just starting a postdoc working on human-wildlife conflicts in Kenya. And Pranav is currently head of the tiger program in all of India for the World Wildlife Fund. So continuing our work in North India. And it's really their work and their efforts that I want to feature in my talk today. To orient you in where our research took place, it's in North India, in Uttar Pradesh, along the border with Nepal. Uttar Pradesh is the most populous state in all of India, and I don't know the accuracy of this. I've heard that if Uttar Pradesh was an independent nation, it would be the sixth most populous nation in the world. So it's all the more remarkable in the context of this high human population density that we still have large-bodied mammals like tigers, elephants, and rhinos in the landscape. I want to give you a little bit about the social context in our study area, the central Terai landscape. It's a transition zone, so it's relatively low elevation before you begin to travel north into the foothills of Himalayas. The communities are very agrarian, they're very poor, they tend to have low levels of education, particularly for women, and their lives are very hard. They literally are interacting with the natural environment every single day throughout the entire year. Here's an example of fishing, an example of timber harvest, and having taken this picture, those trees were not cut with the chainsaw. They were cut by hand, and it's sal forest. A typical home, which tends to be spotless in a footprint around the home. Typically, women are up early sweeping, but the homes are made out of thatch. Those thatch is harvested from the forest, as are the woods, and it typically is a mud and dung floor. A local village near our study area. Poverty and unemployment are very high, and people's lives are very challenging. This is a collage, a collection of photos. This is taken from one of our study areas, a multiple-use forest called Pilibhit, which is now a tiger reserve. And a couple of interesting and relevant things here. There are no villages internal to the forest, but the forest is used extensively for extraction of fuel wood and fodder. So in Uttar Pradesh, around our study area, more than about 80% of all of the cooking and warming of homes is occurring by fuel wood collected often the day before in the forest. So you see people coming in as the sun's coming up, extracting resources from the forest and then leaving. And we see a really interesting sort of temporal niche partitioning in these areas between people and tigers, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. So the Terai landscape had historically supported large populations of tigers, elephants, rhinos, and many ungulate species. As I've mentioned, currently the landscape is highly fragmented, and it's populated by hundreds of human settlements, and human population density is high because of its adjacency to Nepal, and then the market for tigers and tiger parts in India. Wildlife poaching is a significant threat, but poaching is not restricted just to tigers. There's also poaching of tiger prey. And a big part of the focus of Pranav's and Rekha's research is to understand the limits to human wildlife tolerance and the degree to which humans could share the landscape with tigers and tigers share the landscape with humans. Just some photos. This is taken by Pranav on foot, not with the telephoto lens. This is coming back from a day in the field. This will raise your heart rate a little bit, but it's hard to imagine having a world and a landscape without animals like this sharing it with us. Well, why conserve tigers? Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some thoughts. Their cultural relevance, their religious significance, their role in ecotourism, existence value, and of course their ecological role in food webs and in providing ecosystem services and in top-down controls. What about the current status of tigers? Early in the 1900s, we suspected, this is a very rough number, there were well over 100,000 adult tigers. The 2010 estimate was about 3,600, which is a small percentage of his historic range. The most recent estimate, 2018, in India has 2,900, and I put a red question mark there because my students and other colleagues, we haven't challenged this one yet, but the two previous Indian tiger census, 2010, 2014, we challenged and published rebuttals in the scientific literature that these estimates are biased high. So that's why the question mark is there. And tigers face many threats to their persistence: poaching, habitat loss, prey depletion, human encroachment and disturbance. You may have seen just within the last 6 weeks, it was on the national news and in New York Times about villagers killing a tiger in North India. That was in our study area. It was a tiger within our camera population. That is a tiger we knew. And it was in Pilibhit, multiple use forest. And that's obviously an expression of human intolerance. So our research objectives were to determine the status of tiger and tiger prey. Our state variables were abundance and density, geographic distribution. We're curious about how they varied spatially and what were the environmental factors correlated with that spatial variation. And we wanted to develop a distribution map for the Indian Forest Service to improve their management practices and conservation for tigers in North India, focusing not just on tigers, but also on tigers' primary prey species. So to orient you in our study area, so here on this pop-out map, there we are in the border with Nepal. The areas outlined in red are current protected areas. So here's the international border. Here's Pilibhit National Forest. So we also included forests that allowed human daytime use, and again, no internal villages, as well as protected areas. And then Rekha's work has concentrated on the agricultural matrix that lies just outside of the protected area boundaries. So Pranav's work, early on, we've been working since 2008, focused on status distribution of tiger and tiger prey species in the protected areas and multiple use forests. Rekha's work has focused on tiger occurrence, use in the matrix, and the potential for human-wildlife conflicts and interactions. Just some scenes. This is from the forest. These are mostly sal forest, which is native, but there's also a lot of teak forest for when the British controlled India. They did a lot of replacement of sal with teak, obviously for timber harvest purposes. This is the really rich part of this landscape, the Terai landscape, where we have wetlands going into grasslands into the adjacent sal forest. And it is this ecological gradient and habitat diversity that historically had supported such a high abundance of prey and high abundance of large-bodied carnivores, like tigers and to a lesser degree, leopards as well. And also in this picture, these are swamp deer or barasingha, which is a primary prey species of tigers in this part of their distribution. Another picture of this transition zone. Now, this becomes important. These grasslands, when they're fully grown, can be 10 to 15 feet tall. Now, the reason this becomes relevant is the primary crop in the agricultural matrix is sugarcane. And sugarcane, at least structurally, looks like the historic grasslands. And that proves to be a really significant point later in our story. I never get tired of, tigers like to walk along trails and existing roads. This is a daytime photo. This was taken in one of the national parks. We virtually never got photos of tigers during the day in the multiple use forest. They would come out at night. So there was this temporal niche partitioning, the forest being exploited during the day for resources, but no internal villages. The tigers taking refuge in high grassland, swampy areas, and then coming out into the forest at night to hunt for prey. A bit about the primary prey species today in the Terai landscape and their body weights. I have some pictures here. This is cheetal or spotted deer. This is a nilgai, a male. Just an incredibly beautiful antelope. That's a female with young in sugar cane, which looks very much like the native grasslands. This is a hog deer, a swamp deer buck, swamp deer doe, wild pig with young, and a wild pig boar. And again, when you encounter this guy when you're out on foot, during distance sampling for prey, again, it kind of gets your heart rate going pretty quickly. So our state variables, what were we estimating? Abundance by habitat type using closed population mark recapture models, specifically spatial mark recapture models, which allowed us to get an estimate of density. We are just now, given additional years of mark recapture, beginning to get estimates of survival rate. This is a project that Pranav is actively carrying on. And we also do spatial distribution and what are called occupancy surveys. And occupancy surveys are really telling us whether a spatial sample unit is being used by a tiger or a tiger prey species. So it is a property of the sample unit, not directly a property of the focal species. Our methods are to use camera trapping. So at this point, Pranav is just beginning to do some physical capture of tigers in this part of the landscape to put radio collars on them. We captured our tigers with cameras. We use what's called distance sampling to estimate prey density. We use occupancy surveys, which are based on multiple visits to sample unit, where we also have cameras, but also looking for tiger and prey sign. Niche modeling relating abundance or geographic distribution to environmental covariates, and of course covariate measurements based on ground measures as well as remotely sensed data. Historically, tiger census survey, census in quotes, was based on pug marks. So, and this was actually part of our 2010 criticism of the results of the all-tiger survey, was the continued use of pug marks. And the idea is that you could obviously tell the presence of a tiger, though sometimes discriminating between a young tiger, a small tiger, and a leopard is very difficult, but that you could actually take a series of measurements of the pug mark and discriminate individual animals. Now, the nature of the substrate in which the pug mark is left really affects the morphological measurements. So in our opinion, it's a totally bogus method of doing survey, and it has largely been abandoned in favor of camera traps. So we set up arrays of cameras, typically in pairs, and the idea is to get photos of the flanks of tigers. So the one up above, you may be able to see the grid. This is part of a software we use called Compare and Contrast. And tigers have unique stripe patterns. And this allows us to discriminate individual animals. And for those of you who may be familiar with multiple occasion mark recapture models, you have to be able to discriminate amongst individual animals in order to estimate abundance, density, and survival rates. And typically, and this is a skill that Pranav and Rekha have that I do not have, they basically can discriminate about 90% of the photos by eye without having to make use of this sophisticated computer algorithm, compare and contrast, which allows us actually to look up to 10,000 points on the flank of an animal. And our tigers are sometimes curious, and we've had tigers make cameo appearances in our study area from all over the world. This is an example of the survey and sampling effort that Pranav and Rekha carried on. So each of these locations is a station of cameras, and each camera station has 2 cameras, and our typical spacing is approximately 2 kilometers. So you can get an idea of both the spatial extent and the intensity of the sampling that they carried on. So camera trapping, the goal was to acquire estimates of tiger density within protected areas and multiple use forests, to relate spatial variation in density to environmental covariates. And as I mentioned, we use spatial mark recapture, and typically we ran about 1,000 camera trap locations. So the way in which we meet the assumption of closure in a mark recapture model is you set up your camera array. So typically our array would be a minimum of 50 stations, that's 100 cameras. You run them for 45 days, you check them every single day, and then you have to move the entire array. Because otherwise animals are moving in and out of the study area, and you get biased estimates of abundance and density. So the physical labor involved in conducting this research and gathering these data is very high. Again, just some more photos from cameras. This is one of our most photogenic tigers. To give you an idea, one of our field assistants who worked with us, who's 6'3", can walk under that limb without bumping his head. It gives you an idea of the size, and there's one of our cameras. So line transects, distance sampling. We use this to obtain density estimates. We wanted, again, how density of prey varied spatially, and also what its environmental covariates were. We use variable distance line transect surveys, and this was an idea of our sampling intensity. So these are largely done on foot. Now, this is actually from one of the undergrad courses I teach, and it's always fun. This is a distance detection function to spend a little bit of time. So here we're walking on the transect line at 0 distance, and the observer then is recording detections and the perpendicular distance from the line. Now, if we assume that animals are randomly distributed throughout the landscape, then these areas out here, where there's no detection, are the invisible animals. They were there, but we didn't detect them. So what we do, and for those of you who have struggled wondering why you take calculus, is that we estimate this function and integrate this function, and that estimates our detection probability. And by taking our count, the number of observed animals, dividing it by the detection probability, gives us an estimate of the true animals, the observed and the present but unobserved animals. So here's just an example of doing some distance, taking distance measures with the rangefinder along a transect. And notice this transect is at an ecotone, moving from grassland into forest, where we often observe some of the highest prey densities. This is what you don't want to see when you're on foot doing distance sampling. This is a mother and young doing, fortunately, a fake charge. This is one of Pranav's pictures as he was doing distance sampling. And we get curious animals who like to look in our cameras. In fact, the most expensive part of our research is cameras because elephants hate them. So anytime they see a camera, they stomp on them. Now, fortunately, we can usually retrieve the disc, so we get it, but we have to get a new camera. And in areas where there's still high grasslands remaining, we do distance sampling on elephant back. So this is, again, using distance sampling, but instead of walking, we're riding. Now, in terms of how we bring in density covariates, and I'm not going to go deep into any of the weeds in terms of the technical methods that we use. So this is a combination both of remotely sensed imagery and ground plots. The biggest thing that we did here, to bring into our work, was to estimate a tiger density surface based on our spatial mark recapture and occupancy work, and also bringing in an ungulate prey density surface. And then here's just an example of some of the environmental covariates. And the idea here is to come out with explanatory variables for the observed spatial variation in tigers and tiger prey. We also did occupancy surveys. And remember, occupancy surveys are less intensive than spatial mark recapture, though they may often involve having a camera within a sample unit. But we're also using detection in terms of pug marks that can be unambiguously identified, and also scat. So just an example of overlaying a grid on our study area. And these are approximately 170 square kilometer cells. And those were used for tiger occupancy. And then each of those cells was broken into subgrids, where we scaled the subgrids to the size of the tiger prey. And we did that using allometric relationships between body mass and home range size. And again, you need to do that because occupancy is an attribute of the sample unit. So the sample unit has to be logically scaled to the ecology of the focal organism. Again, just more fun pictures. So results to date, tiger density estimates in protected areas and multiple use forests, density estimates, and most of this work now has been published or is in press, landscape occupancy patterns, and we're beginning to get some insights into movement because of our continuing work on running cameras in the Terai landscape, which gives us some indirect inference to landscape connectivity. This is the only table I think I have in here, and the take-home message here from the table is notice multiple use and protected areas, tiger densities, and prey densities. The take-home message here, and one of the things that surprised us, is that often we can have multiple use areas, extensively used by humans during the day, but no internal villages, is comparable density of both tiger and tiger prey. And that deserves further study. But we think, here's our current working hypothesis. The timber harvest that occurs in multiple use forests opens up the canopy. And we see a ground cover shrub layer vegetation response, which we hypothesize is increasing forage availability for tiger prey. And that some level of timber harvest and opening the canopy, some level of human disturbance may actually have a net positive benefit here. These are just, this is just a density contour map across our study areas. Now, a little bit of how we interpret occupancy. So occupancy probability is on the y-axis, and it basically says, in this sample unit, what is the probability that it is being used or has been used in the past by a tiger? And the x-axis is a predictor variable, in this case, a human disturbance index. And we can see a fairly strong negative relationship here between occupancy, whoops, sorry, keep pushing the wrong button, occupancy levels and human disturbance, kind of like you would expect, but notice a fairly significant degree of apparent tolerance here. That's important. It isn't that shape of function. There is a shoulder to this function. Sources of tiger mortality and also of prey, as I've mentioned. We not infrequently find snares and traps in our study area, and those are indiscriminate. Any animal, prey or tiger, that comes by is vulnerable. This is a picture from Reka in the study area in the matrix. It's a very sad picture. This tiger wasn't alive very much longer, moving out into the matrix, hunting for prey. As I'll talk to you about, there's a lot of prey in the matrix, and became entangled in barbed wire. Another occupancy result of interest, again, occupancy on the y-axis, in this case, prey abundance. On the x-axis, seeing the expected positive relationship. But again, sometimes we're very interested in these sites, what are the additional characteristics of these sites that have high occupancy but apparently low prey abundance. So summary of the major findings in this part of Pranov's focal study. Tiger populations have persisted in some logged multiple use forests with high human use. PA designations do not necessarily lead to high tiger abundance and high prey abundance. We think that this is primarily a result of inadequate law enforcement and high levels of poaching. Fine scale distribution and abundance of prey seem to be strongly related to the location of grasslands and wetlands. And wetlands are always areas vulnerable to draining for agricultural purposes. And this is work that's ongoing about looking at patterns of habitat connectivity. By having a photo population of tigers and repeatedly running cameras, though not at the density we did in the initial years, we're able to identify specific tigers and get some idea of their movement patterns. Though our data are not final enough resolution to look at the actual movement pathway. Now, let's move into the agricultural matrix that surrounds and lies between the protected areas. It's dominated by sugarcane, to a lesser extent by mustard and wheat. This is the area that Reka focused on, lying between the protected areas and the multiple use forest. The methods, some similar methods, camera traps, sign surveys, occupancy surveys, but in addition, social surveys to assess people's degree of acceptance and tolerance of sharing the landscape with tigers, and also covariate measurements to understand spatial heterogeneity in the distributions. Here's Reka doing some surveys, and here she's testing the locals' ability to discriminate amongst different species. So one of the big things that Reka did in extending her occupancy work is to model what are called false positives. False positives in both tigers and in tiger prey. These are her study cells, and the cells are about 170 square kilometers, and that's the Sardia River going through the matrix landscape. The color coding is the estimate of occupancy probability. That's winter, summer, and monsoons. So one of the things that we found out here is tremendous seasonal variation in use of the agricultural matrix, with this area largely being flooded in some years and tiger prey are then moving back into the adjacent protected areas. Now, what are the risks to human welfare? Since 2009 in our study area, there's been 14 human fatalities, 11 non-fatal attacks. They tend to be concentrated near protected area agricultural edges. And the known man-eaters, that is the tigers that are known to have killed humans, that are actually captured, and of those 14, 8 of those were in our photo population. They tend to have experienced injuries, usually due to probably being in a snare, having an injury to a foot, or they're very old and emaciated. So they've lost the ability to effectively hunt wild prey. Now, just a bit of the results. Should dangerous animals be conserved? This is a result of RECA's surveys, about 350 respondents who live in the agricultural matrix and makes their living there. The majority were in favor of conservation, with this important caveat, that the conservation be focused within protected areas. But the reality is, almost throughout all of India, the protected areas for tigers are too small. And they cannot, even the existing population, cannot apparently meet its resource needs by simply confining its movement to the boundaries of protected areas. But notice a very high score here also for intrinsic value. So from RECA's much more extensive work than I have time to report, tigers regularly occur beyond the boundaries of PAs. They're common in the agricultural matrix. There's lots of prey in the matrix, particularly wild boar and hog deer are abundant. We see pronounced seasonal variation of tiger use of the matrix. The potential and reality of human-wildlife conflicts is high, but the apparent support for sustaining tigers on the landscape remains high. A typical response when there's been a fatality is the villagers will go to the forest department. The forest department will first come to Pranav and WWF, who maintains the photo library, to see if there's any photos. And often these villagers will have cell phones, so we'll have photos. We'll try to identify if it's a tiger in our known population and where we last had photoed that tiger in order to focus the hunt and to remove that into tiger. But there does not seem to be, at least to date, a universal response to rid the landscape of all tigers. Now, let's move on to wolves. So another project that I've been involved in for the last few years, working with the Turner Endangered Species Fund, is we are attempting to get wolves to reintroduce to Colorado. And we're in the process of collecting signatures to have it on the 2020 ballot. And I would say we're guardedly optimistic that we'll get the required 250,000 signatures, in which case people will decide whether they want wolves reintroduced. And myself and a colleague in my department, Kevin Crooks, for the last couple of years have been traveling around Colorado giving talks to different groups called The Truth About Wolves. So one of the things that's apparent to us is pronounced cultural differences between India and US in terms of tolerance to sharing the landscape with large, dangerous animals. And of course, this is a paradox because Americans are very generous in giving money to international NGOs to keep large, dangerous animals on the landscape as long as they're not in their backyard. And in fact, this was in the 2016 Republican platform. To my knowledge, it's the very first time a species was ever named in a political presidential platform. And of course, this was that there shall be no wolves. As long as there's wolves anywhere on the globe, we don't want wolves in North America. Now, this is in contrast to what we're observing in Scandinavian countries in Western Europe. This is a paper that was in Science a couple of years ago, looking at repopulation in this landscape by wolves. So it's not necessarily a apparent European cultural artifact, this intolerance of wolves, because we see similar cultural linkages where there does appear to be tolerance. So this is what we hear when we give our talks about the truth about wolves. Well, we can't have wolves in North America because there's direct human mortality risk. We can't have wolves because of the negative adverse impact on the livestock industry. We can't have wolves because they compete directly with hunters for prey. So a little bit of the truth. You can read that for yourself. So there's virtually no evidence of direct threat from grave wolves on humans. I have possible highlighted there because the two cases with this occur were believed to be wolves raised by humans and then let loose when they got too big. Now here's some data of livestock losses. And notice the far left are things that have mostly to do with disease and weather-related events. And way, way down there below dogs, we have wolves. And I'm just in the process of updating this slide with more recent data from USDA, and it's the same pattern. Now, how about the hunters? Now, percent of kills, female elk age. This is from 22 years of data from Yellowstone. Doug Smith provided me these data. This is the age distribution of female elk killed by hunters. This is the age distribution of female elk killed by wolves. This is the reproductive value of females at that age. So in a sense, they're taking very different age classes, and they're taking the animals of low reproductive potential. So how does tolerance arise? So this is the part that I hope will generate some discussion in your ideas. Religious practices and belief, perhaps belief in reincarnation, animals viewed as sacred, a deeper sense of spirituality, the continuity of all life, empathy towards wildlife, artistic, creative inspiration. So, as exemplified in much of India's incredible artwork that features wildlife. So, some final thoughts. At least where we are, by we, I mean largely Pranav and Rekha and me based on our experience and them living most of their entire life in India, is they were struck by this contrast between a high degree of intolerance here and relatively much higher degree of tolerance where there are real, tangible, direct risks to human welfare. But we have lots of questions. What are the explanatory factors? Historic legacies, religious differences, the fact that there's more guns in the US than there are people. What's going on here? So I'm going to end there with that unanswered set of questions, but I think it's really important for us to think about being supportive and promoting large-bodied carnivores in this case, elsewhere on the landscape, and being part of a culture that's, in a sense, mostly intolerant to sharing the landscape with these animals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. We do have some time, questions from the audience. And Barry, I will let you pick your questioners.
Okay. Yes.
I was wondering if you considered the UK as well as an interesting contrast, because I would agree that a lot of Western Europe is quite tolerant of wolves, but the UK, I mean, you don't have any, but the idea of reintroducing them is kind of abhorrent to a lot of people there. And I think it's a similar thing to the US, that you don't actually have that much, well, really anything that's truly dangerous, and yet we're quite intolerant.
Right. And do you think that there's similar causal factors to what we propose?
Well, not the guns. We don't have those.
What if I put you on the spot, which I'm going to do,
Okay.
and you had to put forward a hypothesis to explain intolerance in the UK? What would be the first thing you might list?
I would probably say that a lot of the land in the UK is farmland, and the National Farmers Union is a huge lobbying group, so they have a big voice when it comes to whether we want these things.
Similar.
And they don't want things that eat their livestock, so, yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a comment and 2 questions. The comment is, there are apparently more tigers being kept as pets now in the U.S. than there are in the wild.
Yes, I've heard that, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of fear of the large carnivores, I mean, I don't know if these animals are roaming around somebody's house or what, but...
I kind of think they're not.
My question is, one, how economically feasible would it be to have a radio collar on these large carnivores so that people can track them and know where they are and reduce the risk of human-carnivore interaction?
Mm-hmm.
And 2, what are the ecological effects on the landscape or the flora and fauna when you do have a tiger versus not having a tiger? Because I think we saw with wolves there's a clear impact. What happens with the tiger?
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first. So in our area, part of our study area had very low tiger abundance. And just for the sake of time, all those figured with all the dots, those were color-coded by whether we had leopards or tigers at those camera stations. So we tend to see an increase in leopard populations. Leopard populations are much more likely to move into villages and to spend time in villages. They're often taking dogs that are in these villages, but sometimes their diet is not restricted to dogs. So there is this intolerance of tigers of leopards, and I think an argument could be made that leopards are at greater risk to human welfare than tigers are. Now, the economic benefits. Here's an example that we just, and Reka is taking the lead on this. Reindeer herders in Scandinavia get paid for the risk they're willing to tolerate to share the landscape with lynx and wolverine. There's reindeer management units. Even in the absence of a deprivation, there's survey data and says you have this many lynx, this many wolverine. The government requires a minimum population size, but above that, the herder can make a risk-based decision. The more risk they're willing to tolerate, the greater financial compensation they receive. So one of the very first things, not that you can compensate for loss of a human life, I'm not arguing that, but one of the things moving in that direction is to have a risk-based compensation, even in the absence of a tiger killing livestock, that local villages are willing to tolerate. And earlier this morning I had a conversation about ecotourism, which largely is not working where we are, not because there are not tourists, but the ecotourism, the resorts and the guide service are Indians coming from Delhi, from the city. They're not the local villagers to benefit. So I think there are things we can do, but there is clearly a certain level of high risk that we can never make go to zero.
Well, I can ask a question, but for now I'm just going to ask one. Why do we have to submit the decision of wolves to public vote? Is it required in Colorado to in order to reintroduce wolves to have everyone vote about it? Because I feel like that's very complicated. In the end, it's a conservation decision that a lot of people don't even know about.
Yeah, so typically what happens is we get an occasional wolf wandering down from Yellowstone that goes into Colorado. It usually lasts, after it's been located, about a week and a half before it's shot, even though it's federally protected. So there's totally inadequate law enforcement. In my opinion, particularly in rural areas, there's absolutely no shortage of guns or people willing to shoot wolves. The purpose of Kevin Crooks and I going around the last couple of years in Colorado giving talks is to confront these myths about wolves. Now, whether people's minds are open to the facts and the data, this day and age, I'm very dubious about that. But that's the only alternative as a scientists and researchers that we have, is to research these questions and find out what the risks really are. Now, the reason we need to have it as a ballot initiative is individual animals coming down are killed almost within a short period of time. The strength of the wolf is the pack. The strength of the pack is the wolf. They are social hunters. They require a minimum pack size in order to effectively hunt prey. They also require an individual of each gender in order to have a reproductive unit. If you do the probability analysis, the likelihood of having a natural recolonization from dispersing wolves into the southern Rocky ecosystem is practically nil. What we're proposing is an active reintroduction of 100 wolves, 10 wolves in 10 packs on the western slope. And they would be listed as an experimental population, which allows Colorado Parks and Wildlife to actively manage any wolves that are depredating livestock. There's no violation of the Endangered Species Act to do that. Final bit. What's the ability to support wolves in Colorado? This is an analysis that Mike Phillips and I have done. We have just updated. In the last 15 years, the estimated size of the deer and elk population in Colorado post-hunting season is over 700,000 individuals. Taking those 100 wolves, figuring out what their daily caloric content is, their impact on the wolf population is about 0.5%. Couple that with the animals that they tend to take the animals of low reproductive value. So what we're trying to do is to look at the data and the facts and what we know. So wolves are not a threat to the livestock industry. If there is, our ballot initiative has full market value compensation for loss of livestock. If it can be demonstrated it was caused by wolves, it allows for local removal of wolves in problem areas. There's no direct threat to human welfare, and they're not competing with the hunting community. But whether it will prevail, I'm guardedly optimistic will prevail.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
You mentioned a peculiar set of animals that survived with very low prey density. Is that where you also get more human animals?
Yeah, that's what we'd like to know. So what we're doing now, that's a very good question. Obviously, all those sample units are spatially referenced. So one of the analyses that didn't become part of a dissertation, which we're now looking at, is looking at the adjacency of those sample units to human settlements and no livestock holdings. But if I were a betting person, I would bet that you're right. Yes. I think that they're probably preying on livestock. Don't know, but I think that's a tenable hypothesis.
Barry, thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah.
Appreciate it.